Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Thembiso Njangase, the Managing Director of Sobeto Consulting. Today, we're happy and excited to host our dearest friend, Professor P.D. Rolemila, is our guest on the topic of making sense of risk management practices. Good afternoon, Professor. How are you?
I'm fine, Thembiso. Thank you very much.
Great. Prof, we do have some people joining us, but perhaps before we can just allow you to take over the podium and engage on the topic, it would be nice to know a little bit more about Prof. I think, Prof, I've known you now for more than 10 years.
Yeah, more than 10.
More than 10. And in the process of knowing each other, we've had quite in-depth engagements on various topics, academics and beyond. And I'm quite happy that today you'll be sharing with many of other followers of yours, some of the students you have engaged and sharpened, and probably they will be able to reconnect with you on this particular day and on this particular time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but in short, Prof is a professor of project management and procurement systems at UNISA Graduate School of Business, GSBL, and also operate and engage work with at UNISA. And over your years of engagement in operations, we've actually spent time operating in a number of countries: Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Botswana, Zambia, USA, United Kingdom, Sweden, and published quite widely. I see, Prof, you have spent a bit of time in the African continent as part of
Yes.
Is there any reason why you seem to favor? I know you spent time traveling widely as well, but in Africa, it seems as if you've been quite involved quite extensively.
Yes, I think there is a reason, of course, because if you don't like your house, Thembiso, you don't like where you come from, I think you must have something to be examined in your head. So I feel more comfortable to plow back within the continent than anywhere else.
Certainly, Prof, and that is much appreciated. And also like to remind other listeners and those who are joining us that the month of May is an Africa's month of celebration. So happy Africa Month, and I'm sure this particular topic we are discussing will find a particular home in an African continent as much as it will be relevant to other continents as well. But without further ado, Prof, I would like to hand over the opportunity to you. For the listeners, they will get a chance to ask questions at the end of the presentation, but in the main, I will hand over to Prof to be able to take us through the presentation on the topic of making sense of risk management practices. Over to you, Prof.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, I think probably I should start by saying good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I think as well, I need to express my sincere appreciation to Sobeto Consulting, specifically Mr. Thembiso Njangase for, well, inviting me to have this, what I call more of a dialogue webinar. When we were discussing about this particular topic, I was actually struggling to get a proper title so that it can make sense, especially when you look at practices by reflecting on businesses. And so making sense of risk management practices, and I said from normal to disasters, and saying that probably this must be what can organizations learn or businesses learn from COVID-19. Now, I would like just to say, first of all, before I probably talk about the subject matter, that I would like to present probably my talk around 3 stages. The first part, I'm going to give the context. That is just to express a little bit of my thinking, and my thinking is around being proactive. And then the second part of what I'm going to talk about It's going to be more focusing on a paradigm shift and looking at the issues which can actually help us to learn. And then finally, just to ask ourselves, where to from here? If you read through my brief, I spoke about current thinking on risk management within organizations, that it deals with what might be considered as normal. And for me to be able to qualify that particular point, I thought I've always struggled to talk about risk, but quoting a politician, I think some of you may remember Donald Rumsfeld, the former US Defense Secretary. And I would like to start from there. And I want to quote, it was actually during the pre-Iraq wars. And this is what he said, and I quote, "As we know, there are known knowns. There are things we know. That's how we started. Now, I don't know whether that qualifies as American English or Queen's English, I don't know. And then he went on to say, we also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. And then he finished by saying, but there are also unknowns, the ones we don't know, we don't know. Now, when he said known, unknown, no things we know, yeah, of course, if we know, we can deal with everything. But for me, the issue of risk is more of the known unknowns. And the reason why I'm calling it, I'm calling it normal, because there are methods which we use to be able to manage risk in organizations. And we go through certain aspects which are very important in order to be able to deal with risks, but more, I call them normal, because in most situations, if you are looking at your organization, you'll start actually from within, looking at your organization in relation to the environment. Probably you look at the sector where you are, or you look at the industry where you are, and you actually pick up risk events which may be actually within that particular environment. You look at the country, it's where you operate, or countries where you operate, and when you look at the country, obviously, and you want to open up and look at risk, you look at issues like the policies of that country, of those countries. You look at politics, issues which are a little bit more complicated to be able to assess. And then probably you look at the economy, or what I would call economic forces, where you look at the trends, and you look at probably the cycles, and you look at the market and what have you. And probably then you actually go beyond the country where you're operating, and you look at the global environment. Now, that is what I call normal. Normal in the sense that most of the things you look at, those you identify as risky events, they actually happen in other countries, or they have happened in your environment before, and things like that. But it's very rare you'll actually hear people talking about pandemics like COVID. Now, when I was actually preparing for this particular talk, I just tried to look back and to see. And I found actually some fascinating things, that actually pandemics have been with us for a long time. But then I ask myself, why does it look like some organizations are jumping around when this particular pandemic happened? And then I looked at a number of them. Some of them actually fall more under what I would call the flu pandemic, which has been actually happening probably with a different strain. Like you go back even to 1918, 1956 to 1958, when you had 2 million people actually dying because of influenza. Or you look at, for example, the flu pandemic of 1918, where you have got a death toll of between 20 to 50 million people who died of the influenza. And then you look at the sixth cholera pandemic, which happened in 1990 to 1911, where you had closer to 1 million people who died. And then you look at the different plagues which happened, the Black Death, I think, which had something like 75 to 200 million people dead. You look at the plague of Justinian, 541, 542, where about 25 million people died of bubonic plague. So, in short, when you look through the pandemics actually have happened several times. And so my question is, then it cannot be normal to look at a pandemic. It's something which probably we need to marshal the knowledge base of understanding, although they are not the same, but at least to be able to think of preparedness. And that's where I would like actually to focus on this particular talk. And so my focus therefore should be about planning for pandemic risk management. And the question here must be, it must be airy and be geared to what I will call probably the 2P, 2R. 2P, 2R means prevention, if possible, preparedness, response, and recovery. And when I'm looking at these particular situations, I would expect actually that when a pandemic is declared, it doesn't start as a pandemic in most situations. It starts slowly, like the way we were actually hearing this when it was happening in China. But then I could have expected actually organizations, the moment we knew actually that something was happening there, then there was a need for preparedness. Now, the way in which things are, in most situations, these things didn't happen. And you can see some examples with different types of businesses today. I've seen, for example, when we are going to the stage 4, how some restaurants, for example, some sit-on restaurants are struggling to see how they can actually, within a very short time, change themselves into actually embracing the takeaways, which I thought actually that could be one of the mitigation of doing certain things. So my focus, therefore, should be about looking at the way in which we can actually deal with preparedness. And if we talk about preparedness, I think it's better to look at some of the actions which could actually help us within the existing workplace in order to actually be able to go through a pandemic like this. I think my starting point again is to say that every business needs a business continuity plan if we want to deal with these particular aspects. And as part of the planning process, I think that there are certain things which need to be done. And those are, for example, to identify the core services, what is needed to maintain the supply chain, let's say, within the organization, to identify the staffing arrangements, probably the question of how do you telecommunicating, succession planning and cross-skilling, issues like that, to protect the health of staff, if something like that was happened, to develop a communication strategy for employees, customers, and the suppliers, to consider, I think in most situations, financial implications of actually what is going to happen, and to identify contingency plans for the unexpected. And then probably to be able to schedule the plan to look at how those things can be dealt with. So my thinking, therefore, is actually to say that there are 4, specifically probably 3 response times which you can or response stages which you can look at. The first one is, what do you do before the pandemic? It becomes a pandemic, which means when we heard what was happening in China, what do you do? And what do you do during the pandemic? And what do you do after? Now, what you are going to do before is going to be proactive. And I think if you are proactive, you have got a better chance of being able to not to feel the pinch to the extent of those who who are not proactive. And of course, anything which you are going to do during the pandemic and after, that is going to be reactive. Now, in terms of before, I think this is going to depend on prediction. And from what I've observed, especially when you have got a pandemic like the COVID, you depend more on the science. It is those people who are in the medical side, the epidemiologists and all those people who could actually give you a bit of an idea of what constitutes something like what is happening now. So then the issue then becomes, you look at it as a disaster, but then you focus on risk reduction. But then you can think of mitigation and preparedness for me if you have known actually the science of how this particular pandemic actually may show itself later on. Now, the moment actually you start thinking like that, I think you're in a better position to be able to deal with certain issues. Now, during the pandemic, I think the issues there become more about disaster risk management stages, where you look at the warnings, you look at if there is any emergency things you need to do. And when you move into the post, it becomes more the business rehabilitation, and then probably business re-energizing or the reconstruction of your business, depending on how this affected you. So your disaster risk management activities, therefore, will be, you'll deal with the mitigation and preparedness before, and then you respond during the happening of this particular pandemic, which actually that's where we are now, and then you deal with the issues of recovery when the risk actually has already happened. Now, in most situations, when we talk about the risk management plan, it will be more about identifying the risks which may come out of it. And I've already said that this is going to depend on the science, and it's going to depend on listening very careful to those people actually who are experts, who understand, for example, how a virus like this, for example, spreads. For example, today, you'll hear people telling you that even if it is becoming flat, there is a chance that there may be the second cycle. Now, listening very careful of actually what could happen there, and then assessing the impact of that particular risk and developing the strategies to manage risk to your business. Now, that is going to depend again on the type of business you do. Because how do you respond? How do you, those particular strategies, they will depend on the type of business you do. If I can give an example there, I know of a particular consulting company in Cape Town, which deals with, I think it's more of a quantity surveying firm. And I see the response of the managers within that particular firm to the employees is a bit troubling for me, because they are responding as if actually they need a seat in their offices for them to do what they are supposed to do. And as far as I know, most of their businesses could actually be done at home. But then if there was no thinking before, I think that's why probably they're actually jumping around. The second step is actually to look at what I call the business impact analysis. Now, you assess how risk identified in your risk management plan might affect your business operations. Now, you identify then the activities or the tasks that are critical for the survival of your business, and priorities what has to be done to maintain them. Now, again, for you to be able to do the business impact analysis, it will depend, of course, on the type of business you are doing, because it is the nature of your business which will dictate how that actually, that particular analysis should go. And then you go into the incident response plan, where you outline the actions to limit the loss. Let's say the loss of life of your employees, depending on the type of business you're doing, and during this particular time, and immediately after the pandemic. So your incident response plan should go beyond a little bit with actually what you are doing now, and think of actually the post of this particular pandemic. And then, of course, the last one will be the recovery plan, where you aim to shorten the recovery time. Now, and of course, to minimize the business losses following this particular pandemic. And then you set the time frame for resumption of usual business operations. Now, people are saying probably not usual business operations, it may be the new usual business operations. Now, when you say, when you start actually talking about issues of risk management plan, business impact analysis, in this incident response plan, and the recovery plan, they may look like actually you are more trading in what I call the typical, or what probably I started by actually referring to as the usual. Now, for me, my problem, which I have now, therefore, how do you start? I think the starting could start from here, from now. When this particular pandemic is gone, probably it is necessary within an organization to be able to ask the people to come together and ask yourself a question within your organization, and you ask whether what happened, how did the COVID-19 impact on your organization, and then think of managing it and saying, suppose we were proactive, what were we supposed to do? Now, why is that important? I think it actually gives you a chance for you to be able to establish a bit of knowledge base and understanding within the organization, and to start actually thinking in terms of actually issues of pandemics. If a pandemic was happening, how would we approach this particular aspect within the organization? And that, of course, gives you a chance for people to start actually thinking about it. Are you going to put this in your risk register, the typical risk register you do every year? No. But you're actually going to start brainstorming within the organization, establishing a bit of a movement of understanding, and this can help you in future to be able to deal with what I called the before activities in order to deal with it during the pandemic and the after. So the issue, therefore, must be the maturity, the ability to mature in terms of your ability to be able to manage pandemics like this. So for you to be able to do the what I will call the disaster risk management, and you look at the components, the question of being proactive actually becomes very fundamental, because it tells you that if there was anything happening somewhere in Denmark, which is actually within the realm of a virus, something like that, that should be the trigger. And that must be known within the organization. It's a trigger where you now start actually understanding the type of virus which is happening, because you know that because this world is open, it may actually affect you later if you look at what has been happening for some time. So then you'll be able to think of mitigation, you'll be able to think of preparedness to be able to deal with it. But at the same time, it will help you to be able to prepare, so that if it reaches the shores of the country where your business is operating, you'll have a chance actually to be able to respond. And the responding, of course, as I've already said, is going to involve the necessary warnings which may be necessary, which may be required, the emergency issues which you may need to do. And then, of course, if you have a proper proactive prediction approach, and then you have the ability to be able to respond when it happens, then you can actually prepare yourself to be able to deal with the rehabilitation post the pandemic when it has already happened. Now, the normal approach of risk management in terms of whatever we do, I think remains intact. But the problem with pandemics is that if you are, for example, looking at identifying risks which will fall under a pandemic, and it hasn't happened, and you don't know what is going to happen, how are you going to analyze how are you going to identify the sources of risk? You are not going to. So the only time when you can start identifying the sources of risk is at a time when something happens. Like when it happened in Wuhan, probably organizations who had a little bit of maturity in that, had a little bit of skill within, that's when they were supposed to start actually thinking about those aspects. And then to be able to assess those particular risks and look at, for example, the possible severity and the impact of what could happen, the likelihood of happening, and then how the controllability, if those could actually be controlled. And then, of course, then they can actually look at how they are going to respond to deal with a strategy to reduce the possible impact on the business, and to develop probably a contingency plan. So you can't just wait and things happen. And so I'm proposing, therefore, that for now, the organizations can actually have what I call the risk management laboratory for pandemics within the organization, especially after we have gone out of this. And then we start asking ourselves, suppose we reacted when we heard that it was happening in China. But before we do that, we say, what what have we learned from this particular situation? And of course, what you have learned must be the impact of what has happened out of this particular pandemic to your organization. So the question of learning and being able to have a bit of that understanding internally, to understand those 4 activities of risk management, which I was actually talking about. Yeah, those things can happen post, but it is more a question of preparing, being able to say, if any pandemic happens, I think we have the way in which we can approach it, but how do you come up with a framework which is addressing that particular risk? That is going to depend on what type of pandemic are we talking about. As I said from the beginning, that will depend again on how that pandemic is, the type of business you have, and of course, what are you getting from the science? Chair, I think that's what I wanted to say, just to establish, to start the dialogue.
Thank you very much, PD, for the broad positioning of and contextualizing the topic, as it were. We will definitely allow people to ask questions, but maybe let me just start by putting to you a couple of questions that you can probably consider as part of a response. Number one, we're dealing with different types of businesses and sizes. Yes. Risks like these we are dealing with, including the pandemics like this, do you believe that all types of businesses could have been in a position to prepare themselves for the same? Particularly hovering on the point of the unknown, you would never know what you do not know if you don't know it. So different companies at different levels, do you think they could have been in a position to prepare for the same, regardless of the size of the company? Number one. Number two, some of the popular tools that are being used in industries, like SWOT as well as PESTEL, are very common. And as we engage with various companies on a daily basis to advise and support and guide them, they tend to use this. But the question is, how far can you go about thinking of the worst that could happen in dealing with the topic of risk? Because it is a fact. You can go as far as to think on what you can imagine. If you can't, how do you then accommodate that? Thirdly, we are coming from a very strong era where, for example, in 2001, there was an issue in the US, the Twin Tower being destroyed. As a result, a lot of companies at the back of that embarked on a very stringent and in-depth disaster recovery as well as business continuity planning. The question is, will those plans suffice to deal with a pandemic like COVID-19?
Okay. Yeah, can I start with those questions? Very interesting questions. Yeah, I think you are right. First of all, talk about the type of businesses and the sizes. Actually, I'm more worried about the sizes, because there are some businesses which are too small, where you feel uncomfortable that probably they may not have the ability to be able to prepare. And this is actually where probably we need to learn now from this particular pandemic. If those small businesses have an association where they actually congregate to deal with their problems, I think probably that's where to start. Because if you start from there, you have a chance actually of being an association, and where you can actually be able to get the experts to help you actually to deal with issues of preparing. And when I talk about preparing, I don't actually mean that probably you'll be able to prepare to an extent that if a pandemic happens, then it will be more of sailing through. But for me, if you look at a business which completely has got preparation equal to zero, and an organization which has put a little bit of understanding and preparing, I think the effect of this pandemic will have a different impact on those two organizations. So for smaller organizations, for me, I think the best way is actually to work as a team, more in associations, and which actually probably could actually been even supported by the government if possible, in terms of actually preparedness by actually developing certain ways of thinking. And that thinking is a question of knowledge within the organization, where even if you are a 1 or 2 or 3 people probably organization, but there is actually a little bit of thinking of saying, if something was happening like this is how we'll do it. But you are not dealing with specifics. Now, on the question of the tools, yes, I think what I'm suggesting as I'm calling it what? I'm calling risk management laboratories, which can be established now post the COVID. I think this is the time actually to try and use them and look at actually some of your strengths and weaknesses, and look through actually some of the things actually which have happened, and see if you knew certain things, probably you could have done better. And those tools, they will actually give you a bit of, at least a chance to be able to manage what could happen. I am not saying these are panacea, but they will actually give you a chance to be able to brainstorm by looking at certain aspects of facts, all of indications, just for you to be able to deal with those. So I think those tools actually are useful for you to be able to, I think, to get a bit of a bigger picture of understanding. Now, if I go to the third question, when you spoke about the Twin Tower, I don't know to what extent the organizations, for example, which were based in the US and probably even in other countries, what did they learn in terms of the post-disaster issues? Things which I was actually calling the reactive part, the recovery, the rehabilitation of business, the business re-energizing, what I call the reconstruction of business. What did they learn? And I could have expected actually that some organizations who took time to look at the lesson learned, probably they might actually have managed actually probably to cushion some of the effects of what is happening today. Yeah, I think that's how probably I can talk about those three.
Great, Prof. Thanks very much. Those who might have questions, we've got two options. One, you might type them on the messenger and send them through, or you'll be afforded an opportunity to ask the questions directly. So by show of hands, there's a facility on the platform to show hands, and you will be allowed to then voice your question and be able to put it to the prof. So that is open now for anyone who essentially wants to do that. So currently everyone is on the mute, but if you have any question, you raise your hand, then you'll be given a platform to ask your question. Alternatively, you can send through a question via the message functionality. There is a question here, Prof, from Changetai. Yes. First is acknowledged and thank you for the presentation. And the question is, for the construction contracts, such risk calculations and preparations increase the price of a project. And this becomes a threat to infrastructure development project, I presume. The question is, what is your take on this view?
Okay, yeah, that's very interesting. Well, I think first of all, because it's a pandemic, and if I was looking at the situation between the employer and the client, between the employer and the contractor, you are looking at a situation which is completely within the force majeure clause within any type of contract. But the challenge of this particular pandemic will be that most clients will give you extension of time because of what has happened. But by giving you extension of time, depending on some of your insurances which you may have, in most situations, this may not be with cost. So you'll actually find yourself in a situation where, yeah, this actually may require a little bit more of actually being more innovative to be able to deal with various issues. Now, the issue of force majeure, which will happen in any construction projects, will actually be analyzed in such a way that the client or the employer has to take into consideration actually the way in which your business is going to be affected. But again, that is going to depend on what type of a client actually you are dealing with. So yeah, there is a lot of situations of increasing cost and what have you, especially if part of the inputs of that particular project are going to involve, for example, the importation of materials and what have you. Different countries are going to open up at different times, and you may actually still have so many problems of dealing with this particular aspect. Now, what is going to happen here is so many claims are going to come out left and right. But I think if it is managed properly, you'll find actually that it is a give and take between the employer and the contractor, and the things could still happen. But without any doubt, it is going to increase the cost. Yeah. I think that's my response to that.
Thank you, Prof. Leaning on the very same context of this construction project, or as a matter of fact, any project. I mean, our discussion has been predominantly on the business, but if you zoom into projects per se,
yes,
a lot of questions can be asked as the role of insurance. Yes. Amongst other mechanisms to deal with the risks of this. I know you've spoken about force majeure, but how would you advise project teams, organizations embarking on projects going forward, now that we know, obviously, of the pandemic? Because part of what you've said is that after the pandemic, or now that we know about it, then we can be able to implement certain planning and risk measures differently than we had before the pandemic took place. At this particular juncture, you are aware of some construction project and some other massive infrastructure related project taking place. You are then asked to advise where should they focus and start looking. Obviously, each project is different, but where should they be focusing on to start to plan differently?
Well, I think you're right. And this is why when I was talking about this particular, when I started, I spoke about the last part when I said where to from here. I think where to from here is actually to be able to learn from what has happened, to be able to prepare ourselves that in case one day we actually get another pandemic, probably we'll be better off, because at least we seem to appreciate what has happened. But for those projects which are going on now, for example, when they allowed, let's say, to say, well, you can go during this particular phase, I think there is going to be a lot of problems. The problems in terms of those people who work in the proximity of each other, where the requirements of not being closer and things like that. I think those are going to be issues which are going to affect productivity. Because if you are working with a certain groupings of people on a particular project, probably you may need actually to have less people to be able to do that. Now, those particular aspects now have to be responded by the client. How is the client going to do? So, because if you are supposed to work, let's say, on a particular element of work for, let's say, a month, probably it may take longer. Now, taking longer means it is going to cost a little bit more. Now, before actually continuing, the best way probably is actually to be able to have a dialogue and agreement with the client and not actually rely on claims. But there is a tendency sometimes of saying, well, I'm going to do it like this because this is the situation, and then I will claim later. And that could cause conflict in most of those projects. So there's some of the things where this is the time actually where you need to have more of a dialogue with the client rather than a win-lose environment.
End of our conversation, obviously looking at certain examples and different businesses, what would be your take in terms of the continent, Africa, and how so far the pandemic has been, I don't want to say rollout as it were, but has been actually spreading across, and how Africa has been responding to the same?
Yeah, well, I think that's a very important. I've been actually following what is happening, and if I look at the way in which probably South Africa, generally the way we have approached this, in my view, I think it has been more very professional, focused, respecting science. But if you go across the continent, you'll find some countries have followed suit. I know, for example, Botswana, they actually they are actually following most of what is happening here. It's very nice actually to have a very good neighbor. And then, but the moment some countries, they are skeptics. There are things like that where some of the things are not being followed, and we don't know to what extent this is going to happen. And I think this is the time when I thought there was going to be a little bit more communication between countries, where they will actually be able to have a strategy. Because we don't talk about African Union, we talk about business across the continent without borders and what have you. But this is actually one of the aspects which has happened where I was expecting actually to have more focus and probably following the footsteps of what is happening here. And the reason why I'm worried, and I'm saying this because the numbers are still very small in other countries. If it happens, if it goes exponential, I know most of the countries have got no health system to be able to sustain it, and it may become a catastrophe. And one aspect which is coming out quite clearly, whether you are in a project or you are in an organization, it's a question of moving away from mumbo jumbo. If something which is depending on science, you need to listen to the scientists. Whatever your strategies, whatever your responses you are going to have, whether within a project or within an organization, they must actually be a reflection of what the science is saying.
In fact, Prof, that is probably part of my next comment before I read another comment from another participant. When you refer to science, the manner in which, perhaps by virtue of it being publicly publicized, the way the United States government, federal states have responded into this pandemic, what is your comment on it if you have been following, in lieu of using science as a mechanism and a manner of reflecting in order to make certain decisions?
Yeah, I think the United States is a very good example because it's like an a la carte menu. You know, it's there are certain states there where you can see they are focusing and following the science, and then you look at some states and probably at the federal level where you hear certain aspects which are to some extent they take the science only when it suits them, and when it talks about things which they don't accept, they actually jump out of that. I think actually that is the most dangerous way of doing things, because and the moment actually you start misinterpreting or doubting what they are trying to say, whatever strategy you may want to put across is not going to work. And it's actually a pity that a country of the size of the caliber of the US, where you don't actually see a streamlined understanding of what the science is saying, but you hear it, you may hear it, let's say, this week, some probably at the federal level, certain things are being followed, and then later on you don't hear that. And I think that tells you one thing. I don't know whether people can learn from this. I think within a country, it doesn't matter on how you are politically set. I think when you have a pandemic, probably there is a need actually to have a certain way of working which actually focuses more with a clear understanding of the point of responsibility, probably without actually some people actually overriding what the science is talking about. Because the moment you get out of that, whatever you are doing is just more mambo jumbo, and the mambo jumbo actually causes more deaths. And if you take a close analysis, because I am doing this every day, every day I'm doing this, I find actually that that for me is an area where we need actually to respect expertise and actually use the expertise knowledge to be able to respond.
I'll read it as is from Yvette Manuel. Thank you very much, Prof, for the talk. It's an eye-opener. Organizations and businesses definitely need to have emergency preparedness plan in place to deal with pandemics. And what better time to start than now, learning from the impact of COVID-19 has had on the businesses. So Yvette here talks about emergency preparedness plan. Is it the same as risk management plan, Prof?
Well, it is actually. It is actually another way of doing it, because it's like you are absorbing certain principles in order to be prepared. So, and that is what I'm calling the proactive way. So that if you have a bit of what I'm calling the risk management laboratory, if, for example, organizations spend a bit of time after this and they look at it and say, what do you think we could have done to prepare ourselves for this? That is actually the knowledge which becomes actually within the organization to be able to help you to do the what I call the before thinking.
Yeah, we've got another one from Ncube O.
Yes.
In pursuance of localization/industrialization policies, some organizations have instituted supply development programs. However,
Yes.
with the advent of COVID-19, most risk mitigations have focused on business sustainability, or should I say cost containment, and hence leaving a lot of emerging or developing suppliers on the limbo. What is your take on this, and what advice do you have for emerging local supply base?
Well, I think I quite agree with that, and this is why I was talking about all what they have done is what is the normal. That's what I'm calling the normal. And I think what is teaching us today here is that we can't be selective. If we are looking at a supply chain, we need to look at a supply chain from the cradle to the grave. And if we look at it from the cradle to the grave, then we have got an opportunity to be able to deal with those particular aspects. Because it cannot be only about making money. And this is actually one of the aspects which is coming out very strongly. And since you asked me about the US, I'm going to relate this question to the US. I saw they were interviewing one guy who owns a salon in Atlanta. And he was saying things like, I think I've decided to take the risk. I'm going to do it. And then I was asking myself, this guy doesn't know. It's not about him. It's about people he employs. It's about the people, the clients who are going to come. Now, if 15 people come, and then after a few days you hear that 50% of those guys got corona, what is that going to say to the business? So you can't actually afford to have a tunnel vision of looking at only certain parameters and forget other parameters. For me, if you are dealing with a particular supply chain setup, you need to look at the issues of cost, yes. You need to look at issues of schedule, yes. You need to look at issues of utility, yes. You need to look at your stakeholders, which includes your client. And it's by actually looking at the totality of all those people, that's when you can have a proper risk management setup. A risk management which only looks at just a bit and pieces, I think is not a risk management plan, whatever people may actually think.
The question which is coming very strongly is, never mind the sizes of the organizations, is also the question of the type of organizations. I suppose an example of a hairdresser in a situation where there's a total lockdown as it is now, do they have any options to run their businesses taking advantage of different technological alternatives while they're on the lockdown? Or there are certain businesses which lockdown means completely you are out until we are back to normal way of doing things?
Yes, actually, that's a very important point, and that's why I kept on saying whatever I was saying here. I was not saying one size fits all. There are some organizations which will actually be able to somersault and move very quickly. There are some who will actually find it very hard. I was actually watching, for example, in the locality where I stay, when I go for my shopping, I could see, for example, how McDonald's moved very quickly after this level 4. But I could see other restaurants which were still closed, and I think some of them, they are still actually beating their heads on how they are going to do it. So yeah, there are some organizations where it will be very hard for them to be able to even start slowly. And even if they start slowly, they may not even be able to break even. So in certain situations, then I think the reality is going to depend on what kind of pandemic, what kind of an organization you are talking about, and what kind of environment you are actually operating from.
This one, next comment comes close to your domicile area of operations, Prof. That's Mashiela.
Yes.
Mine is more of a comment than a question, Prof. Right. Your talk triggered in me the importance of doing your risk analysis and checking the impact, irrespective of how small your business is. I run a training and development company and have contracts which I cannot service at the moment, simply because I did not immediately do my risk assessment on how COVID was going to affect me. Put in place controls like establishing an online training facility that will have ensured business continuity for us. I mean, this is a comment, Prof, but you are with one of the biggest institutions in the continent and predominantly dealing with students from afar and all over the globe. Have you found your business model accommodating in dealing with such pandemic, or you probably, even in your own context and environment, feel you could have done better as an institution?
Yeah, I think let me just talk about that in two parts. I think the first part is actually to be able to say risk management, I think for me, cannot be divorced from an organization because it is small. So I think it is good actually is acknowledging that fact, because in whatever business you are doing, there must be actually risks. And those risks, if you don't understand them, sometimes you may find a problem. And I'll give you an example. Actually, at least is doing training. I've seen, for example, when the president allowed that even people who are selling fruits and things like that, they can actually do that. I saw one lady actually who sells business in the central part of Johannesburg. I see this lady sitting there with a table, and somebody was interviewing her, and she said she has only sold those fruits for 10 rand. Only 10 rand. She had only got 10 rand. And I said, yeah, actually, you are lucky to get 10 rand. Depending on where you are situated, I don't see actually how you are going to sell when people actually, there is a lockdown. People are not coming in numbers there. This was closer to a place where probably people passes by, but now because there is no activity, nothing, and she could have actually known that. And that's part of risk management. Risk management is not about big money and things like that. It's about being able to deal with the known unknowns. So that's the first part. I quite agree with that. But then the second part, I'm actually saying that when we are dealing with risk management, and this is what I've seen in most organizations, sometimes when you are going through the process, there is a tendency actually for one or two people to close themselves in a room and they start actually identifying risk, doing the risk assessment, thinking about the risk response development, preparing a response control, and then voila, they have a risk register. And sometimes you'll find actually most of those risk registers, if you look at them very closely, they fall short of actually looking at issues upside down. And when you have got a small business, that is likely to happen. So it is better, probably for me, even if you have a small business, at least you have got 2 or 3 minds around you when you are brainstorming the risk events.
There is a notion of pre-COVID and post-COVID, as it were. The impact of what COVID will impact or affect businesses, the livelihood, and many other facets of life, probably one cannot comprehend at this particular point in time. In your own kind of analogy, where do you see the changes and therefore the post-COVID kind of scenario in businesses or in organizations, as it were?
Yeah. Well, I think probably if I want to talk about the pre-COVID and post-COVID, I want to start somewhere. If you talk to most of the accountants and people who deal with money, they normally have this concept of talking about having a reserve. And if you ask them about this question of reserve, having a cash reserve and things like that, and you ask them to open up and tell you what they mean, you'll actually find that it has got a narrow view in terms of the way it should be dealt with. And I think when you look at issues like the COVID-19, you can actually see that probably organizations should think of how they could cushion certain situations for their employees by probably a certain way of addressing, setting up a particular fund, which those people actually who are working in the organization could actually contribute to it. And when a person, of course, retires, could actually probably get their share and things like that. And that actually could actually help to change the thinking on issues like that. But if I look at pre-COVID and post-COVID generally, at a generic level, I'm actually looking at it in terms of saying, if we could have learned from other pandemics which have happened, and I tried to read actually the history of these pandemics. When things were happening in China, that was the time actually to start preparing for this pandemic. Now, some people may be may argue, to what extent can you prepare? I think whatever preparation, whatever brainstorming and preparation you do is better than no preparation at all. Now, when I look at the post-COVID, the impact is going to depend on to what extent your business is. And I want to say something here, which is probably very interesting. I was talking to one of my former students this morning, and he was asking me, are you bored? I said, well, I'm bored because I'm sitting home all the time, but I'm not bored because I don't have any work. Actually, I've been busy every day until today, because the type of work I do allows me actually to continue doing work even when I'm at home. So the pre and post-COVID issues are going to depend again on what type of business you do, because we are going to find so many organizations who are not going to manage to come out. They will be gone. But we are going to find some of them who will come out but limping. But then how that limp is going to affect the way in which they are going to probably to reemerge and do things we don't know. So it's going to be a mixed bag.
Okay, we've got another one, Prof, from Ngube. Again, let me go quickly to undo it. Prof, the contingency plans for multinationals are affected by geopolitical boundaries. That creates challenges in implementing an integrated risk management across countries, as an example. How can these multinationals harmonize their response across these boundaries when their customer or client base may expecting homogeneity in response to pandemic?
Yeah, well, I think that is more of a question of leadership of those particular. I think that's a fact actually, which is affecting some, and that's why I said there are some who are going to be affected, and then they will be able to limp through. There are some who won't be able to do that, and I can assure you, actually, those which have got a geographical spread, depending on how their risk management plans are, if the risk management plans were not as inclusive as actually as Osias was actually referring to, they are going to find it very hard. And I think probably this is actually one of the lessons they can learn. Because if, for example, you had an organization which is multinational, let's say it has a branch in Singapore, a branch in Thailand, a branch in South Africa, and probably Botswana or some other place, I think the effect of what has happened now to those particular businesses must make them to think twice in terms of the way in which they deal with their risk management setups.
One of the questions is in reflection to organizations that are already operating online. Amazon, for an example, at the beginning of the pandemic, as it was unfolding, was said to have been on the patching off or employing 100,000 employees to obviously be part of their employee workforce to deal with issues of ordering online and so forth. You went back to the question. It depends on each industry sector and organization that you are in. The academic industry, yes, which obviously knowledge cannot be kept, as we are saying, you are busy. We cannot be kept waiting until post-COVID. How do you think, generally speaking, and I know perhaps you can't talk of every organization out there, but how do you think the academic industry, particularly the Institution of Higher Learning, have responded to this, maybe globally or internationally? Because I do know that you do a lot of work with other institutions overseas.
Yeah, well, that's a million in the one question, actually. I think even the response of different organizations has been a mixed bag. And can I just probably tell you some of my disappointment? There are some, for example, institutions, some universities in this country, where I think, and I'm talking about now outside UNISA, which is, of course, a bit different from those which are residential universities, where I was, for example, impressed by the principal, the vice principal of University of Johannesburg. When he was talking about now doing things online, he didn't forget actually that the type of students you have are going to condition whether you are going to be successful or not. And straightforward, when he was talking about that, we are now going for the technology. He spoke about data and he spoke about hardware. Very straight. And he went straight actually and said, for example, that they have certain hardware actually in their stores, a certain number, and he compared that number with the number of students who don't have anything who are going to be sent these particular things. And then he spoke about data, because there are some people who are talking about the technology as if actually there is manna of data from heaven, which is going to enter into our computers, and then we can do this. And he was actually clear on what they were negotiating, and if negotiations were not going to happen with these companies, the way in which they are going to deal with it. So different universities, I think, went on this particular aspect differently. But one thing which I've learned, especially on universities in this country, beside UNISA, I found actually that some of them were prepared. Actually, they have a certain level of preparedness, probably maybe 30%, 35%. Like UCT, for example, I could hear what they were talking about. They were almost talking about that they have actually even recorded some of their lectures before and what have you. But one aspect which is a big challenge is that, yes, you can actually go, you can use the technology, but there is another aspect of to what extent are those who are teaching or those lecturers, how are they going to embrace it and be able to present themselves in such a way that the students will be able to understand. But then another aspect which is going to come out, even if you think in terms of giving data, giving the hardware and things like that, the environment where some of the students may be could actually become a stumbling block. So there are so many things to think about. And for me, I'm actually saying that those who, to some extent, had some preparation, probably they need to consolidate. And those, of course, who were, they found themselves probably completely without any particular program, probably there will be a lesson which they are going to learn from this. So if you look even across the world, you'll find actually that different universities have got different capabilities. One good thing about it is that in some countries, like in the UK and Australia, and I think in Canada, because they have certain postgraduate programs which are done with international students, most of them actually they have certain capabilities, but the capability may not be able to actually. I think it can be expanded, and probably it may take a shorter time to be able to leapfrog and to embrace it. The last point which I would like to make is that for you to be able to master the delivery of whatever you are delivering, you need as well to have the ability to understand the system which you are using to do it. And so internally, of course, they need to train their people. I've come to realize that sometimes if you use a particular software and you have got 10% knowledge on what it can do, it is actually like nothing. So they have to invest actually in their preparedness, and this probably should be normal for them to be able to flip out in case something happens, that they can actually be able to actually jump into a situation like this. Because if you listen to the scientists, they're actually warning us that because we are preparing, we are actually playing a lot with the environment and what have you. Pandemics like this are here to stay.
So it is possible that we have organizations which are suffering with perhaps solutions at their disposal, but because they might never have spent enough time to test drive them and increase the level of knowledge of how to operate these, they suffer like those who do not.
Completely. That's a human nature, you know. Sometimes human beings become more lethargic like that, and that is not going to help. And I thought probably, I hope, I would actually expect, for example, because some organizations have got associations, professional institutions. I think this should be one of those areas where we need to keep on probably pushing organizations to be able to say never again, or probably never again with the same impact.
Last two comments, Prof, and then we approach the closing. There's a comment here from Yvette Manuel again, just a comment, but it seems that our business world will be changing. More businesses will be making permanent adjustment after the pandemic has passed in becoming automated and lot of online activity. This is where the Internet of Things is going to come into effect. This is just what I observe. I'm observing based on the happenings. There is definitely going to be new way of working and learning. However, I stand to be corrected. This is just my thought and views. What are your views, Prof?
I think Yvette is spot on. There is no way it can be, people are saying the new normal is going to be the truth. And I think those organizations who are not going to think like that, what Yvette is saying, they will actually suffer the consequences. Those actually who are going to learn out of this, I think they stand a better chance. Because as you can see, actually, it's very interesting when you look at some of the pandemic history. There have been a big share from different countries. And if you look at what is going on, some organizations actually, if they had a little bit of an infrastructure thinking of preparedness, probably they could have actually done certain things. So I quite agree with Yvette that, yeah, that's where we are going. But I'm actually of the view that if we wanted to embrace the technology, we needed to make sure that those people who work in those organizations have got the ability to be able to manipulate those tools.
From all the comments from the experts, the scholars, the people like your colleagues, professors, and many other analysts are showing everything is facing south. It's bloodbath all the way. Now, right. Is it possible that there is an upside to the whole pandemic? In other words, there are offsprings which will come positively to an extent that they will probably have a much more positive impact than the bloodbath we are currently going through.
Yes, actually, probably, I think this country is a good laboratory of some good things which could come out of this if the politicians take this clearly. I think in this country, you have seen actually how, while it was easy for me to talk about having social distance and things like that, but you could see actually the differences in terms of different households to be able to do that. You could see actually that the ability to be able to do that, the economic problems of so many people, the way in which some people are struggling actually to be able to do that in townships must actually make us to learn one thing, to say that probably there is a need to look at the way in which the models which we are using to be able to deal with the economic dispensation of this country. And probably that's not only for South Africa, but even for other countries. And I think that could be a good thing, provided human beings are not going to forget very fast.
So who is responsible then for leading the engagement, the debate, the brainstorming for developing an integrated and comprehensive risk management and emergency management plan for a country in the context of how some of these effects and pandemics are hitting us?
Well, I think, first of all, there must be the central point. The central point, of course, will be different departments within the government. But this is the time actually where those people who call themselves thinkers across various universities, across various consultancies like yours, to start actually thinking on how we can influence the government sometimes to be able to prepare properly on these particular aspects. And there are examples. One example which I know very well is the Singapore example. In Singapore, if you belong in a particular profession or in a particular grouping, there is actually an approach which is fantastic. When they wanted to have an audience with any of these politicians, either the minister or anyone, they actually prepare their material, something like a submission of a paper on what they think the government should do. So when you go there, it's not a pep talk. You actually present your ideas in terms of what you think. And in most situations, things happen. And probably we need to start thinking like that. Instead of being reactionary, we need to be able to say we can contribute. But then we need to organize ourselves. Universities, of course, they can do more, faster. But still, actually, businesses can do the same. A little bit of what I saw on what happened, the way in which this COVID-19 was actually managed, the way people responded, that could be a starting point. And that's probably another part of the good things, as you were saying, which could actually come out of this. But you know, human beings have got one problem. By the time it subsides down and the people start making a little bit of money, they may actually forget that COVID-19 happened.
Those, Prof, who are hopeless, poor, and destitute, people who are already in ICU, using a figure of speech, and I suppose COVID doesn't do much justice, but then to exacerbate the speediness of their passing or their departure or death. What is your comment for those who believe they don't have anything to do but just wait for the day to die?
Well, That is, well, you see, there are casualties, yes, out of this. And probably for me, the only thing I can say on that, my comment is that probably those should make us to think twice. Instead of being selfish, we need to be able to think beyond actually our personal interests. And this is where, now you are taking me to another side. This is where I normally argue that I wish if when we were born, each one of us had a tick or a cross on the forehead. A tick saying that you can lead, and a cross saying you can't lead. Because this is the time actually where we need to learn that if we don't have leaders if leaders do not have the two main characteristics, we are going to be in trouble. And those actually at the bottom of the ladder, they're actually even going to suffer more. And what are those characteristics? The first one is to have a selfless leaders, because then they can think about everyone and not themselves. And the second characteristic, obviously, is actually being a servant leader, to know that this country, if you take it a strata, there are those down there who really struggled, and it's going to take a long time for them to recover, and that they need attention in terms of that particular aspect.
The last comment, Prof, is from Yvette Manuel. Again, she says this is more like training people. In fact, I think it was a response to one of the comments you made earlier. This is more like training people for a skill that can be used in the changing environment, as in preparing for the fourth industrial revolution. Are we ready for the fourth industrial revolution?
Well, I think actually COVID-19 is going to make us leapfrog, because we have seen actually how some of the things can happen if the technology is embraced. But then we need to have proper strategies, because the technology is not just going to jump on our tables. And the strategies must think of the whole continuum of people who can benefit from it. So I think Yvette is right.
Professor Lemila, once again, thank you very much for your insight. We can go on and on to discuss this particular topic, and I'm sure that the continent, the country, and other countries the world over deserve to spend some time in engaging on such, because not only does it benefit us to look at and do introspection on COVID-19, but it allows an opportunity for the country to do a full introspection on itself. Because as we had indicated, some businesses won't survive post-COVID 2020 or 2019, but some businesses will thrive, as a matter of fact, because they will take advantage of what the opportunities are presenting themselves and be able to change as quickly as they can to actually excel and move forward.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. And can I just give you a kudo, give actually Sobeto a kudo. These are the things actually we should do as most of the time. You know, we need to be able to have dialogue. We need to think. We need to do as much as possible, because no one is going to do this for us.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thanks very much for everyone who contributed and participated on this wonderful chat as well. The video recording will be available to share at a later stage. But thanks very much. Let's have a further engagement in future.
Thank you.